Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Aubrey Mullen. I'll be your presenter, and today we're going to explore the major regions of the brain, particularly where the parts of the brain are located, what they are, and what their functions are. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Before we dive too deep into this lesson, I think that it's very important that we review what the central nervous system is, which actually consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And in the system, the brain is a very important and very busy organ. It can control other organs such as the heart and lungs. It can also control your senses, which is sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. But on top of that, it actually is in control of other important human aspects, such as thought, memory, emotion, motor skills, temperature control, the urge of hunger, and other regulatory bodily functions, some in which we're aware of, and others which happen more subconsciously and we don't have to be aware of. But that's a pretty broad way of looking at it. So I think that the way we're going to look at this lesson is we're going to go pretty broad in our classification and identifying the parts of the brain, and then we're going to be working into more specific parts and the functions that are associated with them. Which brings me to the picture that you see here. So the first set of classification, or the way that we should divide the brain, is at a top view. We can see that it's kind of in two big halves, and these are called the cerebral hemispheres. And scientists have found over the years that the left brain, or the left hemisphere, is actually more oriented to your logical thought, your numbers, your word processing, your detail orientation, uh, very number oriented. And then your right brain, on the other hand, is more geared towards, more artistic things such as color, rhythm, spatial awareness, imagination, things like that. And actually, it's very cool with this right versus left side of the brain theory, because this has been a topic of many different research experiments. And one in particular that I like to highlight is the origins of the left and right brain by McNillage, Rogers, and Valatigara. I don't know if I'm saying their names right, but their experiment is very, very fascinating because they focus on the left and the right side of the brain, mostly with the speech and right-handedness, and they go through their experiment on vertebrates because vertebrates have brains that have two cerebral hemispheres that they can test. And if you haven't read this article already, I definitely recommend it. It really shows the division of labor between the two cerebral hemispheres. And once the thought was humans were unique, but their experiment shows that aspects, like I mentioned before, the speech, the right-handedness, the facial recognition, processing of spatial relations can actually be traced to brain asymmetries in, as millions and millions of years previously in vertebrates. So it's a pretty cool classification. Looking at the same article, the authors actually highlight how the brain, or humans and other vertebrates, are actually cross-wired. And what this means is that they've found, let me get my handy dandy laser pointer, that the left hemisphere, which you see here in blue, is actually linked. So the nerves and the motor skills of the right side of the body is what the left brain hemisphere actually controls. And the same is true for the right side of the brain, or the right cerebral hemisphere. That is actually linked to control parts and motor skills on the left side of the body. So it's very interesting how the body is kind of linked, but that also shows the division of labor, again, with these cerebral hemispheres. So now that we've looked at the brain looking on the top, looking down, and we can split it in half, which was those two cerebral hemispheres, now we can look at it from the side orientation and really get a feel for more specific brain structures. And in this particular case, the brain is or can be categorized into three main parts, which would be the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, which you can see is bolded in this image. And I really like this image a lot because it kind of classifies the major parts or the subcategories underneath those three main categories. So for instance, the forebrain, the largest part that makes up that portion or that section of the brain would be the cerebrum. And here we go, let me get my laser. And the cerebrum is this pinkish color. And that's going to be a very large part of the brain. So that's the forebrain. And we'll get a little bit more specific as time goes on. Then for the midbrain, it actually has highlighted some parts here. And then the hindbrain includes the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. And the arrows do a nice job of giving a rough idea of where those subcategories are located. And the cerebellum is here, as you see. And then finally, we have this spinal cord. And remember, this is the other part of the central nervous system. So all of this up here, the brain is one part, and then the spinal cord is a whole other part. So keep that in mind as we proceed. So let us focus in on these three main parts of the brain and kind of go a little bit more in depth in them. In this particular slide, we're going to be talking about the forebrain, or really focusing on that cerebrum, which can also be called the cerebral cortex. And just to orientate ourselves as we talk about this would be the front side of the brain, this would be the back side of the brain. And what we're going to talk about here is you see these sections that we're about to discuss. Now imagine it's not just on one side. This is also going to be mirrored on the other hemisphere. So we're looking at this from a side profile. And it's very important to remember that the cerebrum is joined by a structure called the corpus callosum, which you can't quite see in this image, but it would be located right about here. And the cerebrum is also the largest part of the human brain. It's actually associated with the higher brain functions, such as thought and action, that humans and vertebrates partake in. And it's also composed of what's called gray surface matter. This is the nerve fibers that actually carry signals underneath the surface that allow the brain to communicate with other parts of the brain and the rest of the body. And then you'll also see here these wrinkled structures throughout the cerebrum is actually very important to its function because these wrinkles increase surface area. And these wrinkles are the reason the surface area is really important for the brain in particular is because the more surface area you have, the more room that neurons or your brain nerve cells actually have to make and create more connections and deliver information more efficiently. So let's really talk about this image here that you see. First, we'll start with these, you see that there's four categories or four different colors, and these represent different lobes of the brain. And each lobe is kind of responsible for its own type of job, and it works with the other parts or the other lobes of the brain to help coordinate function, action, thought, etc. And let's start up here. The frontal lobe is actually located just behind the forehead and is associated with many brain abilities such as reasoning, organization, planning, speech, movement, facial expressions. This is they're all important, but this one is very important for more of your motor skills, body awareness, and things of that nature. Then we're going to move to the top part of the brain. So this is right like near the top of your head. And the parietal lobe is actually responsible for complex behaviors such as, senses, parts of your vision, touch, again, body awareness, spatial orientation, things of that nature. And it plays an important role in integrating sensory information from various parts of the body. It also goes into knowledge of numbers and their relations, manipulation of objects, etc. Next, we'll move on to the occipital lobe. And this lobe is located here on the back of your brain and is associated with most of your visual processing. So if you ever hear somebody joke about, oh, your mom has eyes in the back of your head, okay, that's where this joke comes from. And don't worry, it's not just moms, everybody has this. Now, if we move to the last lobe that's highlighted here, this is the temporal lobe. And this is actually located near our ears. And kind of makes sense that it's associated with more of your auditory functions, such as your, what you hear, how you perceive what you hear, the recognizing what you hear. It has a lot to do with hearing and memory. So all of these work together to help our brain continue to function both as a unit and healthily help the person live a good life. So this slide kind of reiterates what we just talked about. However, this is also going to go a little bit more in depth on locating where particular functions occur in each lobe. So you can see over here in the legend that each color is associated with one of the lobes. The cerebellum we'll get to. Remember, that's part of the hindbrain, so that's coming up. But I just kind of wanted to show this slide because I thought it was important to not only show you what functions are located visually in each lobe, but then also more of a finite or focal point for each of these functional areas. So for instance, speech, you can see here, is actually located more towards the anterior or farther back side of your frontal lobe. And your motor control is more located still in your frontal lobe, but also in part of your parietal. You can see here it's right on that fissure, which is separation between the lobes. And it's just, this is a very, very interesting slide to me. I love this picture because I love to see things visually, and this really helps me organize it in my brain. I can see here that most of the hearing or auditory functions are located in this part of the temporal lobe. And if I associate it to where it's located on my head, it makes sense because the ear is right about here. So this is just another reiteration of the cerebrum, the breakdown of the lobes, and then an even further breakdown of how their functions work, what those functions are, and so on. Next, we're moving on to part two of our three main sections of the brain, which would be the midbrain. This section of the brain is actually located below the cerebral cortex, which we just talked about, and above the hindbrain. In this image, you can kind of see the hindbrain includes the medulla. So here's the medulla. So the midbrain, as you can see with this little bracket, is located right in this area. And it's got quite a few parts, which you can see labeled here. And we'll talk about a few of them, but not all of them, because we're just trying to get a good grasp of what is involved and how it works. And so the main thing, or the primary role of the midbrain, is to act as sort of a relay station for our visual and auditory systems. And portions of it are actually called the red nucleus and the substantia nigra, which are involved in controlling majority of body movement and also contain a large number of dopamine producing neurons. And even though the midbrain is one of the smallest regions of the brain, it's still quite important because if you imagine that the neurons in this section starts to deteriorate or degenerate, then what happens is you have diseases onset such as Parkinson's. So even, tiny but mighty, it's still very important despite its size. So now we're going to talk about more subcategories or parts of the midbrain. And a few pieces that I would like to highlight would be like the limbic system, which is also referred to as the emotional brain, which is buried within the cerebrum. It's kind of surrounded by it. And it actually contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And I'll kind of go through each of those too quite briefly. The thalamus's main role is to act like a relay sensory station for information from other parts of the brain to the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is actually there to regulate various functions of the pituitary gland and endocrine activity, as well as some somatic functions. So somatic just means that you are not in control. It's more involuntary. You don't have to think about it for it to happen. And things that would fall under these type of functions would be body temperature, sleep, appetite, and so on. Then you have the amygdala, which is a critical processor for the senses. It's actually connected to the hippocampus and plays a main role in the emotional memories and contains a huge number of receptor sites that are, implicated in rage, fear, and other feelings. It could be sexual, it could be, just other emotions. The hippocampus is actually for memory forming. It also organizes and stores information. In particular, it's important in forming new memories and connecting the emotions and senses, such as, sensory organs, your smell, sound, sight, and it helps you relate or connect it to memories you have from experiences. And then one other part that I'm going to talk about is the pituitary gland, which is very important to link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It actually releases many hormones that can affect aspects such as growth, metabolism, sexual development, and reproductive system functions. It is also connected to the hypothalamus and is about the size of a pea. So it's very, very tiny, but it's, again, tiny but mighty. It does a lot of things for its size. And it's actually located directly in the middle of the skull, right behind the bridge of the nose. So that's the midbrain for you. And finally, we're moving on to the part 3 of the 3 main parts of the brain, which is the hindbrain. The hindbrain is like the midbrain, where it's mostly in charge of involuntary functions. And some of the main parts that I want to point out would be the cerebellum, which you see, let me get that pointer, which is this big ball-like structure back here. And cerebellum is actually Latin for little brain. And it's very similar with its 2 hemispheres and its highly folded surface. It's actually associated with the regulation and coordination of movement, posture. It also is very involved with cardiac, respiratory, and vasomotor centers. And so it is very highly used in coordination and also those involuntary functions that we don't have to think about for our body to properly run. Another section would actually be the brainstem, which would encompass the midbrain, which would sit right up here, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So that's this part right here, which would be the lowest section of the brain. And this brainstem, which is those 3 parts, are responsible for vital life functions such as breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. So let's focus on the pons a little bit too, because this is kind of MVP over here. So the pons' main role is to serve as a bridge between various parts of the nervous system, including the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And it also has many important nerves that originate in the pons, such as the, well, feeling in the face, the controlling of muscles in the face, such as, that allows you to bite or chew or swallow. It also is in control or has many other nerves that take on different functions to help with facial expression and control. And then finally, we'll also talk about and break down the medulla a little bit. And the medulla oblongata's major role would be regulating our involuntary life, which sustains things such as the breathing, the swallowing, the heart rate. So these are all interrelated in those involuntary functions. And since it's part of the brainstem, it also helps transfer neural messages to and from the brain and the spinal cord, and is actually the junction where the spinal cord actually connects. And so this right here connects that spinal cord to basically bridge into the central nervous system as a whole. It is what connects everything together. And that's going to conclude this presentation. I appreciate all of you who hung in there. I know this was a little bit longer of a presentation. As you can see here scrolling on the screen, these were the references I used to create this presentation. And again, thank you so much for coming out and listening and learning about the parts of the brain and their functions.